So, curious to know how your corporate efforts at tackling sustainability deal with supply chains, which I know are often a real challenge. Give us your perspective to assess your level of corporate commitment. And we want to get to particularly getting towards scope 3, right? That's the tough nut to crack. But give us a bit of context as to where you're coming from on that.
Sure. For those of you who don't know, Estee Lauder is a large luxury beauty company.
Who doesn't know?
So we're a manufacturer.
Look at this very attractive group. They're clearly all using your product.
Plenty of customers, or maybe some more customers after this talk. And we essentially make stuff and we sell it. Or we also have third-party manufacturers. So
you sell dreams.
Yeah, we sell dreams. We sell aspirational dreams.
There we go. Yeah.
And hopefully we sell some joy, or people can find joy in our products. So for us, we have had scope 1 and 2 zero emissions since 2020. And we found very early, actually, Ally Newsy, who leads our climate team, as well as some of the folks who are here, Rachel Sherman, Chris Cook. We have an amazing team on our climate team. And we were very early to wind. So we invested in a virtual power purchase agreement in the U.S. and
in Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain.
It does, and it blows into your PPA.
That's right. Well, as it happens, a lot of the wind has been sweeping down the plain, and we actually, since 2020, have made money by selling green energy back into the grid. And so we've made about $5.4 million. Right. What was tough at the outset, though, candidly, was permitting. The U.S. is not so easy to work with on permitting. Interestingly enough, though, that the legislators in Oklahoma are all Republican. And what we find actually in the U.S. is where we have Republican legislators, we actually have less permitting. And so they are more focused on green adoption and green energy.
Less permitting hassles.
Yes. Right. So I think what we've seen over the last, I'd say 6 months is more of a focus on energy security and de-risking for companies like ours. And so we have this supply of inexpensive green energy, and we also are able to sell it back into the grid. For scope 3, which is essentially our suppliers, so their scopes 1 and 2 are our scopes 3, that is a tougher nut to track. And what we've been focusing on is fewer suppliers registering with CDP. So you basically want to take your top 200 suppliers and make sure you have their data. That was the first piece. So we have the data. Now we're working with them. We're actually looking at some power purchase agreements here in Europe to see whether we can collaborate with our suppliers both to lower their scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also for us, again, have secure energy at a lower price.
So this idea of working with your suppliers, first of all, knowing, one of the first adages in business school is what matters gets measured. The second adage is what's measured gets managed, right? So not knowing was a way that companies in the old days used to allow supply chains to kind of do their own thing, right? This was, for example, back in the days when sweatshops were a major concern. Often companies did not want to know who was the supplier to their supplier to their supplier, because once you know, you're obliged to act and the data gets out eventually, right? So better not to ask. But the fact that you're aggregating, you're getting the data clearly shows intent that because it'll become your problem soon enough. Therefore, it sounds like you're helping them with some sort of scale effects to get clean energy so far. Are there other things you're doing, vendor financing or some other forms of ways of helping some of your smaller suppliers upgrade? It might require some CapEx investment, for example, or other kinds of changes that a smaller supplier may not be able to do.
Well, we are working. What we find generally is our diverse suppliers don't really have carbon infrastructure. And so we are working on trainings for suppliers. I mean, I would say.
What do you mean by carbon infrastructure? You mean to understand their own carbon
footprint? They don't have a climate team.
Gotcha.
Data is expensive. And so we've been helping some of our suppliers. But generally, I would say that our philosophy, candidly, is that we want our suppliers to pay for their carbon reduction. What we want to do is essentially mainstream that as a criteria for selection. And so we're working with our procurement teams to make sure that, the availability of data and their commitment to reducing their carbon emissions is part of the selection process.
You're telling your potential suppliers, go green or go home.
Basically.
I got you. Tough love. Okay.
We also on scope 3, we've been working with, a big chunk of our scope is digital on scope 3. And so we've been working on how is it that we can work with, and actually there's a coalition here called Ad Net Zero, working with some of our advertising agencies to make sure that they are aware of their carbon footprint and that they are reducing it.
What that's the positive case that we've been able to make progress. What are the challenges? What are the hard nuts to crack for you?
I would say the hardest nut to crack, although the most interesting for consumer businesses, is how does carbon reduction show up for the customer? How does carbon reduction show up for the investor? Because at the end of the day, we make stuff and we sell it. And so for our team, if we are not able to rationalize the costs of carbon reduction.
So let's separate those two. You mentioned the customer and you mentioned the investor, right? Does the consumer of your products, the ultimate customer, is this even an issue that's relevant? I mean, with oil companies, people get it, greenhouse gases, there's awareness. But if you're buying face cream, is it even one of the top 5 concerns or top 10 concerns for anybody? What might be the carbon footprint of this product? What do you find?
Well, there is no one consumer. What we have found through consumer insights is it really does matter, but it shows up differently per age group, per country. What we've seen in carbon reduction is, for instance, in the US, consumers care a lot less about the company's carbon footprint than their own. So we've worked with our Aveda brand, for instance, to have a carbon calculator on the website so that they can make choices. I'm sure you all have seen that, where you can opt into 1 shipment instead of 5 shipments. So that we have seen, solidly in the US. In Europe, we particularly find, and the UK, that carbon reduction, sustainable packaging, ingredient transparency really is a table stake. In other words, many consumers will not even look at your product unless they see those attributes. What we've also seen, though, is that the brand marketing teams are the most capable of making claims, essentially. And so what we've done on our team is that as part of the new product development process, we integrate sustainability claims at the beginning of the production of a life cycle of a product. 75% of the environmental impact of a product is determined in its creation, essentially. So we've integrated there and we've created a library of claims, essentially. What we're in the midst of doing now, candidly, is trying to better understand how do those claims show up in each country. So the bottom line is, yes, it matters. The other group I would say that it matters to are investors, because the investors are essentially, they're looking where as they say in American hockey, where the puck is going. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen, we just completed our latest investor survey, and of the concerns in the environment, climate is number 1. And so we have seen, for instance, we've had, again, through the great team that we have, great rankings, for instance, on CDP and MSCI and SASB. And as a result, when we meet with investors, they are very happy with our climate efforts. And
But I just want to make sure I understand the point you're making, because what I've seen among investors is that there is a variability on 2 sides of the Atlantic, that investors in Europe and UK may be much more concerned about climate issues, less so in the US, especially in the current political environment. Are you seeing any of what we're seeing in other companies and other sectors, or are you finding American investors putting climate as number 1, which should be surprising to me?
Well, we don't identify our investors. We do a large survey, so we basically look at our top 30 investors. I would say that there are, one of the complexities, I'm sure you know, because you do this for a living, around the ESG funds, was there was never a great definition of ESG.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I think the climate funds were sort of clear cut in terms of what the parameters were. We certainly see many U.S. investors still very concerned because climate is a risk. Energy insecurity is a risk. High price of energy is a risk. I would say, though, definitely there is more concern probably in Europe and the UK than in the U.S.
Do you find that your Asian operations have a different flavor? Obviously, huge beauty industries in Korea, China, and elsewhere. How do you find your work is different over there?
Our regional brands, our regional leads determine claims. So, for instance, on refills, what we find in Europe and the UK is huge consumer demand for refills. We see the same in Asia. In Asia and in China in particular, the refills are considered more value. So you get the big pouch of skincare to refill.
Right.
What we found in Europe and the UK is if the big pouch is really not very attractive, they're not as attracted to it. And so again, you can have the same practice that's good for the environment in a consumer company, but it expresses itself differently in the markets.
Right.
And that's why our market leaders are critically
I'm
important.
glad you mentioned packaging. I want to come to that in just a minute, but let me ask my audience if there are any questions. That's great. Let's get some microphones to the front row here. We got our beauty mavens very interested in this. Actually, why don't I just come to you? Yes, we'll just come across for the three questions. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Isabel Devan. I'm at the Carbon Trust. And obviously we have carbon labels. And what we find is that many of our clients are shying away from using some of the claim mechanisms and assurance for fear of greenwashing. I mean, what would you say to those who are shying away from that? Do you think it's important, or do you think it's too risky?
Well, I have to admit I'm a recovering lawyer, so I'll put that out there. I think it really depends on the company. We have tended to be very conservative in our claims, and knock wood, it has served us well. We have found that carbon claims, just a carbon claim, likely is not going to drive any value, depending upon the product. Again, you have to couple it with other topics. So, for instance, we've done some testing for our Le Labo brand, and what we find, for instance, on B Corporation, which does have climate requirements, as you likely know, that if we just put B Corp, I'm sure you've seen that signage, people don't really respond very well. They're not going to buy a product. If we put Le Labo with B Corp, people do respond. So I think a lot of it has to do also with the brand equity.
Thank you. Yes.
Dr. Stanislav Edward-Shmenev, Environment Europe Foundation and a member of the Club of Rome. We've just published a study of the largest 30 companies in the world and ESG correlations with various KPIs like share prices and return on equity. And your company's in there, so you might be interested.
Okay.
But I would like to ask you a question about treatment of water use, waste, and the impacts on biodiversity in your supply chain and in your operations in general. Where are we, on these issues? Because obviously biodiversity is equally important, if not more important than climate, because emissions are absorbed by plants and plankton.
Yeah, and in fact, tomorrow we're going to our Whitman plant here in England. So on water, we have hyper-focused on our, again, manufacturing facilities and been able, through newer water systems and capital investments, to greatly decrease the use of our virgin water, which we've done, for instance, in our original plant, the OG plant in Long Island in New York. On biodiversity, what we have seen and have invested in is what we call ingredient transparency. The bottom line is people want to know what's in their products and why it's in their products. And so we have published an ingredient glossary. What we've tried to do on biodiversity is focus on ingredient stories, primarily for fragrance, but also on transparency. Our feeling is an educated consumer is the best consumer. What's been a little tougher for us, honestly, has been we have many, many retailers who have many, many subsections, and they're a bit confusing. So we're leaning in on consumer education.
One last question. Did I see a hand here as well near the front? And just a quick question, quick answer.
Hi, my name is Laboni Saha. I'm a founder of a sustainable luxury brand called El Saha. Big fan of Estee Lauder, the brand, and more than 10 decades of a customer. So it's not 10 decades, 10 years being a customer.
I was going to say
that
if it's 10 decades, we are really doing
you're doing a great job with that. I want some of that. Give me some of that cream.
We have a few decades ourselves, so tell me what you use.
So my question to you is, you mentioned that the US consumer is more interested in their own personal carbon footprint rather than the company footprint. I think sitting here as a customer, I think we automatically think the company is doing the right thing. So we expect it, we expect that the company is doing the right thing without necessarily shouting out about it. And especially when beauty products are concerned, I think the question is, people are going to always buy things that suit their need more than the environmental aspect of the product. So you mentioned consumer education. What does Estee Lauder Company do in terms of priming the consumer to make better choices, because ultimately they're buying the product because it suits them, not so much worrying about the environment when they're doing that?
believe the consumer is going to make the right choice for him or herself. What we try and do on the sustainability team is basically create a suite of best practices that the brand leaders can then deploy. But in certain instances, so for our packaging goals, we have brand scorecards that our brand presidents are responsible for, essentially, in their compensation and their performance. And so we are loading in sort of behind the scenes, I'd say, more sustainable practices, but we do leave it up to the consumer, because ultimately we do need, consumer activism is a very big force. So we need consumers to arm themselves with information, and we need them to make informed choices.
The power to the people. You
Yes.
heard it here first. Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time for this session. Thank you,
Oh,
Nancy. We could go on much longer. You're a very popular guest.